Today we examine a case from the late 1800s. How did a young lawyer end up on the gallows for a crime no one ever saw him commit? Our journey takes us to Richmond, Virginia, in the years after the Civil War. In March of 1885, a discovery at the city Reservoir would set in motion an investigation built entirely on inference and suspicion. No witness, no confession, just a chain of circumstantial evidence that would lead one man to the gallows. The discovery came on the morning of March 14, 1885. Lysander Rose, keeper of the old reservoir, was making his routine inspection when he noticed signs of disturbance along the waterside path. The ground was scuffed. Something had been dragged, or a struggle had taken place. Then he saw her, floating face down near the bank. When police pulled the body from the water, the scene told a story of violence. Her dress was torn. Bruises marked her face. She was small, less than 5 feet tall, and visibly pregnant. Near the path, investigators found a broken shoestring and a red glove, 2 sets of footprints pressed into the soft earth. The coroner's initial ruling was suicide. An unwed pregnant woman in 1885 Virginia faced devastating social consequences. Perhaps she had chosen the water over disgrace, but the physical evidence suggested otherwise. The torn clothing, the bruises, the signs of struggle. This did not look like a woman who had walked calmly into the reservoir to end her life. The body remained unidentified for several days. This was not unusual in cases where victims carried no documentation and had no immediate family nearby to report them missing. The police circulated descriptions through local channels. 2 different identifications were made and later proven incorrect. Finally, on March 17th, the woman was positively identified as Fanny Lillian Madison. Madison had been born in Virginia in 1863. She was the daughter of Charles and Lucy Madison. Her family situation had been troubled for some time. She had lived away from her parents due to conflicts that kept her separated from them. To support herself, she worked as a teacher and governess, moving between positions as opportunities arose. In the months before her death, she had been working in Bath County, Virginia, far from Richmond. The confirmation of her identity changed the nature of the investigation. This was not an anonymous drowning. Lillian Madison had connections, a history, and people who knew her circumstances. Most importantly, investigators learned she had been 8 months pregnant at the time of her death. This fact intensified the central question. If she had taken her own life, who was the father of her child? If she had been murdered, who had reason to want her dead? The coroner's inquest reconvened. After considering the physical evidence more carefully, the ruling was changed from suicide to murder. Lillian Madison's life, in the years before her death, had been marked by independence and difficulty in equal measure. She was a young woman living on her own in an era when such arrangements were uncommon and often viewed with suspicion. The estrangement from her parents meant she had limited family support. She moved from one teaching position to another, earning what she could and maintaining a degree of autonomy that came with considerable social cost. Those who knew her described her as capable and hard-working. She was small in stature and quiet in manner. Her work as a governess placed her in the homes of families who required her services, but did not necessarily regard her as an equal. She occupied a space between the working class and the families she served, belonging fully to neither. By the summer of 1884, she had formed connections that would prove significant. She spent time at the home of a family named Walker, where she stayed during a period between teaching assignments. It was there, during July and August of that year, that she was frequently in the company of a young lawyer named Thomas Judson Cluverius. By October of 1884, Madison had accepted a position in Bath County and left Richmond. She was already pregnant, though she had not publicly acknowledged her condition. She continued working as long as she could manage. As the pregnancy advanced, her situation became increasingly precarious. An unmarried woman carrying a child faced ruin in the social landscape of 1880s Virginia. Employment would disappear. Reputation would be destroyed. The question of what she intended to do, and who would take responsibility, became urgent with each passing month. Thomas Judson Cluverius came from King and Queen County, Virginia. He had graduated from Richmond College in 1882 with a law degree. His education had been financed in part by a relative named Jane Tunstall, who had also housed him during his studies. Cluverius was building a career in law, a profession that required respectability and social standing. He was 26 years old in the spring of 1885. He was also Lillian Madison's first cousin. The relationship between Madison and Cluverius had developed quietly over time. They were relatives, which meant their association would not have seemed unusual to outside observers. But by the summer of 1884, when both were staying at the Walker household, their connection had become romantic. Witnesses later recalled seeing them together frequently during that period. Their behavior suggested intimacy beyond what family ties would explain. By the time Madison left for Bath County in October, she was carrying a child that investigators would later believe was fathered by Cluverius. The revelation of this relationship fundamentally altered the shape of the case. This was not simply a question of an unmarried woman and an unknown father. This was an incestuous relationship between first cousins, a connection that violated both legal and moral codes of the time. If Cluverius was indeed the father of Madison's child, he faced personal and professional destruction. His legal career would end. His reputation would be irreparably damaged. The scandal would follow him for the rest of his life. These circumstances gave him, in the eyes of investigators, a powerful motive to silence Lillian Madison before she could expose him publicly. In early January of 1885, Lillian Madison returned to Richmond. On January 5th, she and Cluverius checked into a hotel in the city. She registered under the name Fanny Merton. A maid who serviced the rooms later testified that Madison had not slept in her own bed that night. The implication was clear. They had shared accommodations despite being unmarried. After this visit, Madison returned to Bath County, but the situation had reached a critical point. She was visibly pregnant. Time was running out for any resolution that might avoid public exposure. On March 13, 1885, Madison returned to Richmond once more. That evening, she and Cluverius were seen together by witnesses who later testified to their observations. The two were walking in the direction of the old reservoir. It was late at night. The reservoir area was secluded and quiet. No one reported seeing them return. This was the last confirmed sighting of Lillian Madison alive. Exactly what happened in the hours that followed remained a matter of interpretation and dispute. The prosecution would later argue that Cluverius lured Madison to the reservoir with the intention of killing her. The defense would suggest that Madison, despondent over her circumstances, had taken her own life and that Cluverius had been elsewhere at the time. No direct witness ever came forward to describe the events of that night. What remained were the signs left behind at the scene and the body discovered the following morning. When investigators returned to the reservoir site after identifying the body, they examined the area with greater attention. The broken shoestring found near the water suggested a struggle. The red glove appeared to have been dropped or torn away, during some kind of physical confrontation. The torn dress and bruises on Madison's face supported the theory that she had not simply walked into the water of her own accord. The two sets of footprints observed near the scene indicated she had not been alone. The physical layout of the location also mattered. The reservoir was not easily accessible. Someone unfamiliar with the area would not naturally wander there at night. Madison had been brought to this place, or had come with someone who knew it. The path leading to the water was uneven and poorly lit. For a woman 8 months pregnant and barely 5 feet tall, navigating this terrain alone in darkness would have been difficult and dangerous. The presence of a second set of footprints suggested she had been accompanied. The question was, by whom, and for what purpose? Investigators also noted what was absent from the scene. There was no suicide note. There were no signs that Madison had weighed herself down or taken deliberate steps to ensure drowning. The positioning of the body and the evidence of struggle pointed toward violence rather than despair. As the investigation progressed, the theory of murder gained strength, while the theory of suicide became increasingly difficult to support. Among the items recovered near the reservoir was a small metal object that investigators initially cataloged without much attention. It was a watch key, the kind used to wind pocket watches common in that era. As the investigation focused on Thomas Judson Cluverius, this seemingly minor piece of evidence took on greater significance. Cluverius owned a pocket watch. Shortly before his arrest, it was discovered that his watch key was missing. When shown the key found near the reservoir, witnesses familiar with his possessions identified it as matching the type and style he would have carried. Cluverius could not adequately explain how his watch key had ended up at the scene of Lillian Madison's death. He suggested it might have been lost at an earlier time, perhaps during some previous visit to the area, unrelated to the night in question. But investigators found this explanation unconvincing. The key had been found very near the location where Madison's body was discovered, and near the signs of struggle. The timing of its loss, coinciding with Madison's death, seemed too precise to be coincidental. The watch key became a critical link in the chain of circumstantial evidence. It placed Cluverius at the reservoir. Combined with testimony that he and Madison had been seen walking in that direction on the night of March 13th, it suggested he had been present when she died. For the prosecution, the watch key was a physical connection between the accused and the crime scene, a small object that carried enormous weight in the absence of direct eyewitness testimony. When confronted with the evidence against him, Thomas Cluverius offered a defense that was both simple and maddeningly incomplete. He claimed that on the night of Lillian Madison's death, he had not been at the reservoir at all. He stated he had been with another woman, whose company would account for his whereabouts during the critical hours. This alibi, if verified, could have cleared him entirely. But Cluverius refused to reveal the woman's identity. He would not name her. He would not allow investigators to question her. He insisted that revealing her name would compromise her reputation, and that he would rather face conviction than expose her to scandal. This unexplained alibi became one of the most peculiar and damaging aspects of his defense. If the woman existed, and if she could confirm his story, why would Cluverius not allow her testimony to save his life? The prosecution argued that the mystery woman was a fabrication, a convenient fiction designed to create reasonable doubt without providing anything that could be checked or disproven. The defense countered that Cluverius was acting as a gentleman, protecting a lady's honor even at great personal cost. But to many observers, including members of the jury, the refusal to substantiate his alibi appeared less like chivalry and more like an admission that no such alibi existed. The trial of Thomas Judson Cluverius began on May 5, 1885, in Richmond. It immediately attracted widespread attention. Newspapers across the country followed the proceedings. The courtroom was filled daily with spectators eager to witness the case. The prosecution faced a significant challenge. They had no eyewitness to the actual killing. They had no confession. What they possessed was a series of circumstantial clues that, when assembled, suggested guilt. The defense had to convince the jury that these clues, however suggestive, did not meet the standard of proof beyond reasonable doubt required for conviction. The prosecution presented testimony establishing the relationship between Madison and Cluverius. They called witnesses who had seen the two together in the months before her death and on the night she disappeared. They introduced evidence of Madison's pregnancy and the belief that Cluverius was the father. They highlighted his motive, arguing that exposure of an incestuous relationship and an illegitimate child would have destroyed his career and reputation. They presented the physical evidence from the reservoir, including the watch key, the signs of struggle, and the condition of Madison's body. The jury deliberated on the weight of what they had heard. They considered the watch key, the testimony, the motive, and the absence of any other plausible explanation for Madison's death. In June of 1885, they returned a verdict of guilty of first-degree murder. Cluverius was sentenced to hang. His attorneys filed appeals, but the conviction was upheld through the legal process. Execution was set for January of 1887. The case illustrates the limits of certainty in criminal justice. Circumstantial evidence can be powerful, particularly when multiple pieces align to form a consistent narrative. But it remains indirect. It requires interpretation. It asks juries to infer what happened rather than to observe it directly. In the Cluverius case, 12 citizens examined the available facts and concluded that guilt had been established. The courts agreed. The execution proceeded. Yet doubt persisted in the minds of many who followed the case, and that doubt has never been fully resolved.